The Whyte PRST-1 is a mountain bike like no other, and no, not just because it was named after the evil robotic dog from Wallace Grommit, because no bike had been built like this before or after. At the time, many people thought this was the best mountain bike ever. We'll see about that, shall we? Back in the late 90s when these bikes were launched, what did I think of them? If I'm honest, I thought they were, how can I say it, less aesthetically pleasing than I would like for a bike. In fact, I thought they were a fucking dog's dinner, and they couldn't be good for the type of riding that I did. But was I right? They gained a cult following with fearsome supporters who owned them, who rode them, and said just how good they were. And in fact, Whyte sold 3,000 of these bikes. So today's the day for me to put my reservations aside. I'm actually really curious and quite excited to ride this thing, see how good this thing was and is, and if it's so good, why don't they make them anymore? Now is the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and like this video. It definitely helps us out. The Whyte designers at the time had Formula 1 experience, and at the time they were also designing the full suspension bikes for Marin. So the pedigree was there to be thinking outside the box for a bike with engineering reason to back up the frankly mad looking design. So what's different about this bike? This basically. If you can call that a suspension fork, it's basically a 4-bar linkage 100mm travel suspension fork that bolts directly to the down tube of the bike and uses a Fox shock for the damping qualities. So Whyte's +4's linkage suspension fork came about because the engineers thought long and hard about the two biggest problems with standard suspension fork. Basically, stiction in the seals. So when a fork hits a bump, it's actually flexed backwards a bit when it hits the bump. And that sort of moves the legs obviously, and it adds friction into those seals, so it makes them harder to move. And also, when the fork compresses, the steering angle, the head angle, actually gets steeper as the front end of the bike drops. The fork is basically two halves welded together, and with that shock tucked underneath the bike, well, that fork is super stiff and super light, kind of like a rigid fork. The fork kind of reminds me of a Gervin Vector fork, but it's really a different concept, and obviously the Whyte has a much more all-bike design than just a fork that bolts onto any bike. Whyte also protected their designs with multiple patents. We have seen other much newer forks like this, like Trust and Motion, although the Trust business no longer exists, I believe. And we've seen more recent versions of linkage forks, like on the Structure bikes. I had a push on these a few years back and couldn't believe the feel. They just move, they don't seem to start, they just go. Also with the fork, it's got a rearward axle path, so a bit like these high pivot rear suspension designs we've seen at the moment. Super active, so when you ride in something, it can move up and out of the way with that impact. I think that's going to feel really weird on a fork, but I don't know. Interested to try that one out. Also, really interestingly, the trail on this fork does not decrease like a standard fork as it goes into travel. So you need to think about that as the steering angle and the relation to where the tyre sits on the ground. So that does not decrease like a standard fork. The bike has got 4 inches of travel front and rear, I believe. And it isn't the fork that's the only sort of unique thing about this bike. Actually, if you look at the way the wheels mount, you've got these old school standard quick release hubs, but you've got these bobbins that attach into them, basically like 20mm bolt through, and they sort of get clipped into the fork with this sort of quick release system that has some of the advantages of a modern bolt through. And this was actually inspired by Honda race bikes and the nose cone on Michael Schumacher's Benetton. So that gives you an idea of how old this thing is. So this is a cross-country bike, a bike that's designed to have really good small bump compliancy and keep moving forward, basically be an efficient bike. So yeah, I wouldn't have ridden this bike back in the late 90s anyway. I was all about big jumps and downhill bikes then. So to put my history aside and take this for a spin and see how good a cross-country bike this actually is nowadays. yeah, it's okay, but it's the front wheel buzzes, which is like the scariest thing ever. You know, you sometimes buzz your back tyre on your seat or whatever. The front tyre buzzes when it bottoms out and takeoff. It goes burp. I guess it's the bottom of the shock there. This doesn't feel that nice. How does it feel? Well, I don't know. I'm quite shocked actually, and a few different things, some good, some bad. Nick behind the camera just said he feels like he's filming a Sam Pilgrim video, which I know what he means. Also, I rode down that really rough fast bit, and it honestly sounds like you've got a toolbox and thrown it down a set of concrete steps. Sounds bad, and there's some of the old components I think let the bike down, but if I'm talking about just the sort of the design, how it works, the fork feels amazing for some things, for what it's designed for, and that is riding cross country. Like those real little stuttery routes, there's loads on this trail, it feels amazing. It's like a magic carpet. I'm actually really, really impressed by that sort of, I don't know what I'm going to call it, compliance, small bump sensitivity. You just float across them and it doesn't feel like they slow you down. Whereas on a normal suspension fork, it does feel like you get pushed back on every single one. So I can see why you would want to use a fork like that. I can see the advantages of having a modern bike like that. However, this is 20 years old. This actual bike is 20 years old as well, so you can feel it. It's a bit ropey around the edges, but it's got old geometry. It's got 26-inch wheels. They don't work that well on this type of riding, at least. The fork, in cornering, it feels weird. I don't know if it's just the long stem. You need to have all those spaces under there to give you the space for that linkage to move. I don't know if you could run a shorter stem. Obviously it's old geometry, so it is short anyway, it might not work that best. But it feels like sometimes when you turn in on technical steep stuff, the front wheel just sort of flops, the bars want to flop over, and that feels horrible. Whether that's just a stem, it almost feels like the fork's got loads of offset, I don't know. It kind of feels like, if you're going straight across rough stuff, it's brilliant. For riding technical stuff, it is scary. And the fact that that tyre bottoms out on there, that is terrifying. I've hit a few bumps and bottom the fork and it goes, and it almost wants to send you over the bars. It hasn't got quite that close yet, but feels terrible. And it's obviously not that simple. It's an old bike. These bearings feel a bit shot. I need to get the Allen key out now and check everything, but there's a lot of creakiness. There's a lot of movement going on in those bars. You've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 bearings at least running this fork. That's pretty complicated. Although, you know what? Whyte came with lifetime warranty on his bearings. So I wonder if I could just call that guarantee in and get some new bearings for it. Obviously, they're gonna last quite a long time, these bearings, but I don't know. There's something loose here. I can't tell you what it is. I'm gonna have to check a lot of things, but that feels horrible. I think this bike is a little bit let down by its 90s components. The shocks feel fine, could need some love. The brakes, actually, these Hope brakes, I used to run these back then, they're actually pretty good. I've sprung a leak, a seal on the rear brake is gone. The triple chain set, oh my God, it's a nightmare. Change comes off everywhere, even in the middle ring, pedaling on the rough stuff. It's ghost shifting, it's coming off. Crunch. What the f***ing? The bars are narrow, the stem's long. It's kind of let down by its 90s bits, let me say. So it's kind of unfair on the bike as a whole a little bit. Something as well I'm thinking of now is like, you know, I'm riding some jumps on this. I've done some fairly rough downhills. And you think that's actually not what this bike was designed for. However, you know, a modern cross-country bike, they're kind of going up to 120 mil now. The stems are getting shorter, the geometry is getting more capable. Cross-country World Cups are really technical. So a modern cross-country bike, you can't really say that anymore. You know, they can go really fast downhills, they can do jumps, they can do drops. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that just goes to show how good a modern cross-country bike is, whereas the old ones were good, but they were really specialised. And whereas a modern one, you can do kind of anything on them. So what do I think of this concept as a whole? Well, let's start off saying I'm being unfair really, because I'm comparing this bike to a modern bike, whereas it's 20 years old. Don't forget, you know, or if you're not around in the late 90s, riding mountain, you won't know, but suspension forks back then, they were just getting good, but they were, you know, something like a Marzocchi Bomb, I think it came out in 1997, and that was a game changer. But that was a kind of more downhill orientated fork. It was heavy, you wouldn't use that on a bike like this. Not to forget that the reliability of those 90s forks was terrible. You had to get them rebuilt, they would leak oil all the time. So a shock, you know, they are more reliable. They're not 100% reliable, but definitely more reliable than a 90s fork. Could this bike be, you know, sort of updated, made into a modern bike? I honestly think that sort of linkage fork is really good for some things. If you're doing, I don't know, epic rides, you're doing transcontinental, you're doing the Tour Divide, you're doing moorland rides for hours and hours, that is brilliant. If you could make a modern geometried linkage fork bike, 29er, you know, this is a light bike, it's crazy. If you could make a carbon version with, you know, like I say, modern geometry, I think for pure out and out cross country, it would be amazing. Where it falls down for me is on the more technical stuff. It just feels weird. Yes, you've got the rearward axle path, it's great for small bumps, it's just the rest of it doesn't work. And actually what killed this bike in the 90s was, I think it was a RockShox Sid, I think the Whyte engineer said. The forks came out, they were mass produced, they didn't have any stiction or very little stiction compared to the older forks. They were stiff. They got rid of a lot of the disadvantages that they were trying to overcome with this fork. But I'm not sure that explains it completely away. I still think a linkage fork can be great. It is complicated, but I honestly think this could be translated to a 100 mil modern carbon bike, 29 wheels. That would be a bike I would like to try.